Good morning, everyone. This is the
Building
Building
Bridges.
Bridges Summit,
It's Tuesday, June
Tuesday, June
22nd.
22nd.
Event is
The
now
event is
live.
now live.
Good morning. Um, it's a lovely morning here in Richmond. I hope you all had a pleasant weekend. Thanks for joining us again today. Before I start with today's lesson, I'd like to remind you all that you are free to ask questions in the question and answer box that is on the right of your screen. I thought I would point out this is the first time I have done this kind of training personally. I participated in it, but I've not been the presenter myself. And what I found that I miss is the interaction from you all, from hearing your questions and stories and comments. So please feel free, and I encourage you to comment, to ask questions, and if you have a story that illustrates a point that we're making, or maybe it illustrates the other side of the point that we're making, please feel free to go ahead and put your comments in the question and answer box. If you'll remember, Wednesday of last week, we started by reviewing what a mental model is. The important takeaway from that is to understand that the time frame for people who have lived in generational poverty means at least 2 generations have been living in poverty. But the time frame for poverty is today. It's very hard to think past today. If you're working so hard, if every ounce of your mental energy is taken up with the very basics of getting through to tomorrow. Do I have enough food in my pantry to give the kids dinner? Is my car going to start? If my car starts, is there enough gas in the car? I missed a day of work because one of the kids was sick. Am I not going to be able to pay my rent, which means I'm going to incur a late charge, which is going to put me even further behind. So the time frame for poverty is the present. It's today. There's no gazing off into the future. The problem that this creates for people in poverty is that they do not develop the ability to future plan, which can lead to some questionable decision making. So also from that exercise, we learned that the underlying principle of people living in poverty is their relationships. Their relationships are the most important thing to them and often cause them to make unfortunate choices because they're afraid to let go of relationships. For example, they might say, I had to quit my job so I could stay home and take care of my kids. Well, being able to provide your kids with a roof over their head and food is also taking care of your kids. So the principle of relationship is what people in poverty depend on, partly because relationships are what they own. They don't own their house. They may not own a car. They certainly don't own a vacation property somewhere. They don't have wonderful jewelry and sterling flatware and oil portraits hanging on the wall. What they own are the relationships and the people in their life. So the relationships are what drive a lot of the decisions they make. And it's hard for people who are middle class or wealthy to understand those things. And so very often we judge them just because we don't understand. The other thing that we talked about on Wednesday of last week was the Bridges concepts and constructs. Bridges Out of Poverty is not a program per se, but it is a list of concepts that you need to understand so you can successfully work with people in poverty. It's hard to build a program for people in poverty if you don't include the people from poverty. The welfare reform legislation that was passed in Virginia in 1995 and in the country in 1996 was based on the premise that people in poverty make bad decisions. Well, sure, people in poverty make bad decisions, but so do people in middle class and wealth. But bad decision making isn't what put them in poverty. So you have to understand the concepts that the Bridges material is built on, to begin to understand how Bridges can move a community forward. On Friday, we talked about language and how children who grow up, who spend their life in poverty, have only heard about 13 million spoken words by the time they are 4 years old, whereas people who grow up in the upper middle class and the professional classes, those kids have heard probably 46 million words. And so the impact of language development and the fact that the language of poverty is spoken in the casual register, which is a vocabulary of between 400 to 800 words, that also limits children when they go off school, which is why Head Start and preschool programs are so important for children in poverty, because we basically sent them off into a foreign country. Education and work are middle class institutions, which is not to say that no one from poverty ever becomes a teacher or owns a business, but as a general rule, those are middle class institutions. And so we also touched on storytelling or discourse in poverty when we watched the video, What About Jack, and saw that storytelling in poverty or relating information is very circular, and it's entertaining, but it's a little frenetic and a little chaotic, whereas storytelling or information sharing in the middle class and wealth has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. So communication is much more direct. And now in social services, many times when we interview a person and ask a question, we get a whole lot of information, but it may not be the information that's needed for us. You know, we may ask a question like, are you working? And we get a whole long story about the car and the transportation and the ride they thought they had from the neighbor, but the neighbor got sick. And it's very frustrating if you are middle class and you don't understand the circular discourse that people from poverty are used to speaking in. So we spent some time on Friday on language, and then after we talked about language, we talked about the 8 resources that help people get out of poverty or stay out of poverty. People think that poverty is just about money, but if that were the case, why would you have an athlete sign a multi-million-dollar contract to play professional sports and then he gets injured and can't play anymore, and 3 years later he's an Uber driver or working at a car wash? Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but poverty is not just about money. It's about emotional health, physical health, mental health, spiritual belief system, support network, role models, and so on. So if you took notes or make a list of anything, I would encourage you to remember what the 8 resources that people need to stay out of poverty are. So today, I'm going to get my PowerPoint up here, and what I want you to do is think for a minute, just a couple minutes, about what you think the causes of poverty in the United States are. And I would encourage you to write whatever it is you think in the comment section. And then we will take some time to go over sort of a complicated chart of what the causes in poverty are. So I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, and while I'm doing that, like I said, go ahead and start thinking about what you think the causes of poverty are, and please take a minute to put that in the question and comments section. Now, the PowerPoint asks you to choose one or two causes from your list and share them with the group, which is easy if you happen to be watching this from a location with other people. But if you're sitting at home like I am, I understand that this might be a little difficult. So I'm hoping that you all have made a list and have come up with several causes of poverty, what you think the causes of poverty in this country are. So now I'm going to show you in the research continuum of poverty, we have to look at causal factors in 4 different context areas. The first one is the behaviors of the individual. And like I mentioned earlier, welfare reform legislation in the past has always focused on the behavior of the individual and the fact that people in poverty very often made bad decisions. And while the behavior of the individual is certainly important and a part of it, it is not the only cause of poverty. The second area is the absence of human and social capital within the community. And very simply, human capital means you have people in your locality who are able and competent to perform the jobs that you have in your locality. Social capital very basically means the opportunities that help people move onward and upward are available in your community. The third area is human exploitation, and a good example of this is payday loans. If you've ever read any legislation about payday loans, or actually there's a very telling series on Netflix called Dirty Money, and it just talks about how vicious payday loans are, and that's an excellent example of human exploitation. The fourth area in the research continuum are our political and economic structures. And I think we talked briefly earlier about some communities are more supportive and more embracing of people who are trapped in poverty, and other communities seem to have a much more stringent attitude and believe that people are in poverty because of bad decisions that they've made or their own behavior and so on. So in addressing the causal factors of poverty, or in particular in trying to eradicate poverty or improve the conditions of people in poverty in your locality, you can't just look at one thing. You have to look at all 4 things on the continuum here to really address the whole entire holistic entity. So looking very quickly at the items that you wrote down as what the causes of poverty are, would you say that your list is basically behaviors of the individual, or does it include human and social capital, human exploitation, or political and economic structures in your locality? And which of these areas is what in your organization you all are most focused on? And again, I would encourage you to add any comments. Although I can't see them right this minute, I'll be able to see them later. So just take a minute and do that. So this slide now is one reason that this online training is more helpful, because trying to display this slide on a wall in a building with this tiny little print is particularly unhelpful for people. So in the furthest column over on the left, that column is titled Individual Behavior and Circumstances. And so that's where the topics of causal factors of poverty address individual behavior and circumstances. And you'll see right at the top of the list is racism, followed by various kinds of discrimination: age, gender, disability, race, sexual identity, bad loans that people have made, credit card debt, a lack of savings. People don't have a skill set or an appropriate skill set. They might have dropped out of school, which contributes to a lack of education. There may be alcohol or other substance abuse issues. There may be disabilities, job loss, teen pregnancies. A couple of commissioners ago at the Virginia Department of Social Services, one of our commissioners said that the recipe for poverty in Virginia is children out of wedlock, which is not a moral issue, it's just an economic fact, and a lack of education. So if you want to be poor, be sure to curtail your education and have kids that you can't afford. I think we left off with early language experience, how language development in children in poverty lags behind children in middle class and wealth. Child rearing strategies, bankruptcy due to health problems, street crime, white collar crime, dependency, work ethic, and that goes back to the comment that the gentleman made at the University of Richmond when he said he didn't see what the big deal was. If you need money, you get a job. It's not that complicated. And the response to that is, okay, fine, but what if you never saw that? What if you worked, if you lived in a home, you grew up in a home where that just did not happen? You did not see somebody get up and go off to work every single day. And then we have lack of organizational skills and lack of various amenities that come with employment. So those are all factors that contribute to poverty for an individual, but they are all tied to individual behaviors and circumstances. So in the second column from the left, you have your community conditions. And again, these are the elements that are present in the community or in your locality that contribute to poverty. Or help, don't help, but prevent people from moving onward and upward. And again, at the top of it is racism, followed again by discrimination, age, gender, disability, race, and sexual identity. So while it is an individual issue, it is also a community condition if there's racism in your locality or discrimination. So layoffs would be a community condition if you had a large employer who all of a sudden folded up their tent and left, and you are left with a significant percentage of your population unemployed. Then you have middle class flight. In my city, in Richmond, after the city of Richmond annexed an area of Chesterfield County to increase the white voting majority, we also had white flight of people moving out of the city because they didn't want to live in a locality where they were all of a sudden a minority. The other thing that happens is gentrification, and I know various places in Richmond where you used to be able, even 10 or 15 years ago, to rent a moderately priced apartment or buy a house. Those areas have been gentrified. So in particular, one apartment complex that was in the west end of Richmond, where the apartments were moderately working class priced apartments at that point in time, probably $800 a month. Now they were knocked down to build condominiums where the starting price is $500,000. So gentrification is also a community condition. We have plant closings, which we discussed, underfunded schools, a weak safety net, criminalizing poverty, And we have certainly seen a lot of that across the state in the last 3 weeks. Employee insurance premiums rising in order to drop companies with a record of poor health. Charity that leads to dependency. There's a book, if you're interested in reading it, called Toxic Charity, that discusses how well-intentioned people who mean to do good in the community create sort of a sense of dependency where if I'm just really trying to help you solve your problems, you become dependent on me to solve all of your problems. So we have a high rate of illness leading to high absenteeism and low productivity. We have a brain drain, people leaving the locality to go elsewhere where they might have better opportunities. Our city and regional planning, in one locality I worked in, you didn't dare use the phrase workforce housing because the Board of Supervisors knew that what you were talking about was low-income housing. And I guess the feeling is that low-income housing is never going to pay in terms of real estate tax or even personal property tax enough to balance out what the low-income housing cost in terms of public transportation, education, and so on. And then there's a mix of employment and work opportunities. Mix of employment and wage opportunities. You know, there's only jobs at the lower end of the spectrum. Also lack of access to high quality schools, childcare, and preschool, and then a downward pressure on wages. So that list of things is all things that happen in the community, and how the locality that you live in is weighted against helping people move onward and upward. So then,
Catherine, real quick, not to interrupt you, we're getting a lot of comments that the slides are not advancing. What slide are you on right now?
I'm not advancing. I'm on, all of this is on one slide, the causes of poverty.
Okay. All right. Just making sure.
Is that the slide you're looking at?
That's the slide that we have. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. There's a lot of information on that slide. So I just talked about the first column on the left, then the second column from the left, and then the third column is exploitation. Does that make sense? Okay. So
can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Some people are saying they're not seeing the slide at all.
So
if you're not able to see the slides at all, best you can do is refresh your browser window. If it persists, we can try screen sharing on your end again, Catherine.
Okay. I mean, is that going to work if some of you see it and some of you don't? Okay. Shall I move on, Vicki?
Yeah, go ahead and move on. If you all are not seeing the slide, can you send me a message in Q&A, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A section? If you look on the right, it's the bottom square, says Q&A, and I'll get that information to the IT person. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
No, and if you all continue to get the comment that people can't see the slide, let me know, and I'll refresh the PowerPoint and see if that helps. Okay, so talking about exploitation, again, top of the list is racism and discrimination by age, gender, disability, race, and sexual identity. Again, exploitation, like I mentioned earlier, payday lenders, one of the absolute worst. We have lease purchase outlets, which are basically your rent-to-own washer, dryer, sofa, TV sets and so on, those are very exploitative because you end up paying for something forever that if you had been able to buy would have cost you significantly less. So then we have subprime mortgages. People in lower incomes pay more for a mortgage if they can even qualify for one. We have sweatshops. We have human trafficking, employment and labor law violations, wage and benefits theft, landlords, sex trade, internet scams, drug trade, poverty premium. Actually, the poor pay more for goods and services, and this one is not hard to see at all. If you go into a neighborhood that is a food desert, and the only place to buy food is a convenience store, and look at the difference in what you pay at a convenience store as opposed to if you went into Kroger or Food Lion. And then day labor. All of those things are exploitative issues where people are really taken advantage of because of the condition in the community. So the last column, again, racism, always at the top of the list, followed by discrimination. And then we have financial oligarchy, the military-industrial congressional complex, return on in political investment, corporate lobbyists, bursting bubbles, free trade, recession, lack of wealth-creating mechanisms, stagnant wages, insecure pensions, healthcare costs, lack of insurance, deindustrialization, globalization, and these are all very high-level, overarching things that happen in a state or in a locality. And the point of this slide, with its way too much information and tiny little print, is that when you address the causes of poverty in a locality, you can't look at just one thing. You can't look at just that individual. You have to look at the conditions in your community. You have to see if exploitation is a regular and tolerated situation, and then you have to begin to look at your political and economic structures. So I'm going to move on from that slide, and I hope everybody follows me. Any problem moving on?
We see your slides on our end.
I'm sorry? What was that?
We see your slides on our end over here.
Okay. So when we talk about the behaviors of the individual, some of the topics that we would talk about are dependency. Have we created dependency in our lower income people? Single parenthood. And again, this is not a moral judgment. This is an economic fact of life. Children who grow up in single parent households are more likely to be poor. Not a judgment call at all. We do see bad behavior of individuals and groups in poverty. We see different values and work ethics, and a lot of that is caused by, as we mentioned, it's hard to develop a work ethic if you've never really been around it, and values are different because, going back to the mental model, we live in today. We are not worried about something that's going to happen in 3 weeks. And so that affects our values, and that can make us make bad decisions when we do have a little bit of money. We see the breakup of families. We see addiction and mental illness. We need to talk about the language experience and discrimination. These are the things that we look at when we talk about behavior of the individual. And again, these topics, poor people don't own them, but they're topics that have to be addressed when you're trying to eradicate poverty. The assumptions that we need to make, or the assumptions that we sometimes make in error, are that by studying the poor, we will learn what changes to be made. The second is the poor are somehow lacking either by choice or circumstance, and lacking can mean so many things. They are lacking in circumstance, but they are not lacking in intelligence or energy or problem-solving ability. People assume that poverty is a sustainable condition and it will always be with us. And while to a certain extent that's true, it doesn't mean that we should just accept it for what it is. We still need to work to help people rise above and beyond. And then there's an assumption, don't blame the system, change the individual. Well, that's why the welfare reform initiatives of the mid-90s really did not work. We still have the same sorts of problems that we had in the mid-90s because we did not look at the system. We looked at the behavior of the individual. In looking at the behavior of the individual, the strategies are work first. Work it's almost redemptive in the way that it changes a person's life. Work can give a person hope. It can give a person confidence. I hope you all didn't hear that. My son just dropped something in the kitchen. Careful there. We hold individuals accountable for their choices. And I know promoting marriage is sensitive, but if you just look at children raised in single-parent households are more likely to grow up in poverty, that's where the promote marriage theory comes from. And it's basically don't have kids you can't afford, which is pretty bold, I think. But the fact of the matter is children in single-family households are more likely to be poor. We need to look at treatment interventions, abstinence education, literacy issues, find a way to enhance the language experience, and then comprehensive sex education, which again goes back to having children that you can afford. Into the next area of research, the human and social capital, the topics that you have to talk about and the assumptions that people make. The topics are the lack of employment in your locality, the lack of education that people have, inadequate skill sets so that people aren't able to do what jobs might be available, the declining neighborhoods, middle class flight, and the lack of a career ladder between the service and knowledge sectors and discrimination. So many jobs that people in poverty can get are, minimum wage jobs that are basically dead-end jobs. And sometimes the reason why people in poverty will quit a job is because it doesn't really matter. There's always another crummy job. If you have a crummy job, there's always a way to get another crummy job, another minimum wage job. But that basically just keeps people where they are and is very prohibitive as far as helping people move onward and upward. The assumptions that we can make is that by studying the human and social capital, we learn how to work within the community to create acceptable conditions for those at the bottom of our economic scale. We need to enhance our resources rather than blaming. Blaming isn't really going to solve anything. What we need to do is begin to enhance the resources that they have. The strategies obviously improve education, help people enhance their skills, full employment and growth in the labor market, which is a particularly sensitive subject at this moment in time when we've got more people on unemployment than ever, and that's a pretty difficult issue just at this moment in time. This anti-poverty programs are a strategy. Policing communities so that there's less crime. Head Start programs are just critical for children to negate the impact that the casual register and the language of poverty have for them. Neighborhood associations are positive influences in the community, and then we need to hold our social systems accountable. Going into the third column of the previous slide, human exploitations, the topics and assumptions. The topics are, are people being exploited for profit? Low-income people with bad credit who get their furniture from rent to own, clearly they are being exploited for profit. People who use payday loans. The system is it's heinous. It's almost impossible to get out of a payday loan cycle once they have entered into it. We have the exploitation of dominated groups for markets, and sometimes exploitation of regions for resources and raw materials. The assumptions that we make is that we believe in the United States that if you work hard, you can overcome all existing exploitations. And while that is true for some people, for probably a small minority of people, it is certainly not true for all people. And the dominant culture is reluctant to legitimize the category of exploitation and to acknowledge exploitation, and is often resistant to new strategies. We need to educate ourselves about exploitation. We need to recognize our own involvement, if it exists, in any sort of exploitation. Understand, recognize, and support anti-human exploitation movements, and do what we can to make the system fair. And I think the two most common exploitation venues are payday loans and rent to own, because those are two particular areas where once a person has fallen into that trap, it is almost impossible to get out of it. And that Netflix series Dirty Money speaks to people who have gotten caught in the payday loan cycle, and how it's so invasive, and it's so relentless that it's very, very hard to get out of that. So it helps to be educated about those kinds of things. And so the last column that we talked about in the causal factors of poverty, the political and economic structure. The topics are deindustrialization. I mean, there was a factory in Richmond that closed some years back because the man who owned the factory became aware of a movement to unionize, and so he didn't want to have to deal with the union, so he just closed his company. That impacted so many people. We saw an immediate rise in our food stamp caseload. We have to look at the race to the bottom, how people, the gap between the rich and the poor becomes larger and larger and larger, and a tiny percentage of people have most of the money. Globalization is a political and economic topic. Increased productivity, shrinking middle class, economic disparity, corporate influence on legislators, and again, discrimination. The assumptions are studying the poor is not the same thing as studying poverty. and the political and economic structures that contribute to poverty. The middle class and people in poverty have the right to influence structures in their own interest, just as other classes have done. The problem is they don't know how, and they don't have access, and they don't have time. Don't blame only the individual. We need to change political and economic structures. So in talking about strategies for changing political and economic structures, we have to look at whole system planning as far as the social health index. We need measures of accountability beyond shareholder profit. Our communities need intellectual capital. We need people who can plan a healthy community based on a social health index. We need to create economic stability, a sustainable economy, and wealth-creating mechanisms that develop a middle class. So this module of Bridges Out of Poverty really does get into the very convoluted and complex issues that create poverty and keep people in poverty from moving onward and upward. And the point really of getting into this much detail, into political and economic structures and exploitation and the community aspect and the individual aspect, is to understand that this relieving poverty in your locality is not a quick fix, and it has to be addressed again on all 4 content areas. We can't just look at the poor person and fix things. We have to look at the entirety of these 4 areas of research, the whole continuum of the research, if we truly do want to make a difference. Is it easy? No, it's pretty complex, it's pretty convoluted. But if you want to be successful, you have to address all of it. There's valid research in all 4 areas. There are so many causes of poverty, that whole entire slide with those many, many things on it. And what that means is we need a wide array of strategies. And Ruby Payne's first book, A Framework for Understanding Poverty, offers a way to understand the complex economic issues and to do a critical analysis of poverty and prosperity. Why is my slide doing that? Okay, so this gives you a planning tool where, when you're working with your community partners, that each individual barrier, whether it's an individual action, organizational action, community action, or the overarching policy that governs it, has to be addressed in the 4 research areas: individual behavior, human and social capital in the community, exploitation, and the political economic structures. You can't address individual action only in the viewpoint of individual behavior. You also have to look at it in the human and social capital, in exploitation, and in the political and economic structures. So when you're thinking about the problems in your community that contribute to poverty, this is where you start with this particular worksheet, and as you write down the barrier, you take it across all four areas of research to actually be able to help the person move onward and upward. This particular module, I almost have to apologize for starting you out on Monday morning with something this convoluted and complex. So the next module is the hidden rules, and this is way more entertaining.
Catherine?
Yes.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
I have a couple of requests for you to define financial oligarchy?
So, I was kind of hoping you wouldn't. Um, so that would be the power brokers in your locality, the bankers, the mortgage lenders, the big heavy hitters in the locality that make the decisions, and they have the time to meet with lobbyists and city council and board of supervisors and general assembly, and they make those are the people who really heavily influence the uh, financial health or the financial rules that govern. I know there was a lot of pushback when I guess the state tried to address payday loans. You know, people who own payday loan businesses are making a lot of money from that. The interest rate on a loan can be in the hundreds of percent. So there was very heavy pushback in the General Assembly towards the General Assembly by the people who were invested in that behavior. So when you talk about a financial oligarchy, who you're talking about are the people who own the banks, who own the credit card companies, who are invested in the institutions that are setting the rules for how money is used and managed. Does that make sense? It's kind of when I hear the word oligarchy, I always think of Russians. So it's a confusing term. Is that what you were looking for?
Makes good sense to me.
Okay. Other questions?
I did not see any other questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's about 10 to 10. So Aaron, if you would put up the break slide, and we will begin again at 10 o'clock. Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so thanks for coming back on time. I noticed one question or comment a minute ago about the financial oligarchy, and I wanted to just comment a little further. How I interpret that is the people in your locality or the state who make the rules about how money is handled, and those are often people who are heavily invested, work in finance, have access to lawmakers and legislators, and there's various kinds of power and authority. There's legitimate and there's inferred and so on. And so in the financial oligarchy, the power comes from the control of the money. So I thought I would just add that and hope that explains a little further. So I'm going to bring back my PowerPoint and hope that this works. Okay. Is that up? Everybody see it? Anybody see it?
We see you.
Okay. All right. Just checking. Thank you. So hidden rules are the commandments or the processes and procedures that govern a particular place or group or event. And very often they are not, they're not things that you talk about. They're things that are just assumed. They're things that have been going on. They're the kinds of things that the explanation is, we do it this way because this is the way we do it. And there are rules everywhere. Families have rules. Clubs have rules. Work settings have rules. When I worked in Powhatan, nobody ever told me that I shouldn't leave my dishes in the sink in the kitchen after lunch. But I began to realize that that was a rule because nobody ever did it. And if someone did it, there was a lot of conversation about it. And you probably have similar rules in your family or your workplace setting. In my own family, whenever we celebrated a birthday, when my mom was still alive, the habit was the first piece of cake went to whatever child or person had the birthday. The birthday person always got the first piece of cake. But my mom, because she was the matriarch, she was generally the oldest person in the group, she always got the second piece of cake. That's nothing that I ever explained to my sisters or my children or my daughter-in-law, but that was just what the rule was. That was what happened. So when my daughter-in-law's sister gave her a wedding shower and they were passing out the cake after the presents had been opened, one of my daughter-in-law's sisters told her later that she said, I think I must have made some kind of mistake because I was passing out cake and Andy's grandmother said, what do you have to do to get a piece of cake around here? Well, by that time, my daughter-in-law had been around my family long enough to understand that my mom always got the first piece of cake. That was just a hidden rule in our group. If any of you all have read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, he grew up in poverty, but he had a lot of the resources that are needed to escape poverty. They didn't have money, but he had a strong support system. He was smart. He was healthy. He had role models and so on. So he managed to finish high school. He went to college. When he got out of college, he wanted to go to law school. And one of the requirements for the entrance process was he had to attend a dinner. So he gets to the dinner, the formal event, and he sits down at the table and he realizes there is more sterling silver flatware, more knives and forks and spoons at his place setting than he had ever seen before in his life. and he sort of panicked because he didn't want to look like a bumpkin. So he excused himself, went out into a hall, and called a friend, a girl that he knew, and he told her. He said, "I don't know what to do with all the silverware," and she told him, "Pay attention to the most important person at the table and do what they do. And if that doesn't work, you just start on the outside of the silver and you work your way in." So there was a rule there about silverware that he just did not know because it wasn't something that happened in his family, but he recognized that there was a rule and he knew that he didn't know the rule. So he used his support system, one of his resources, to ask, how do I manage this rule? So there are examples in your workplace, possibly in your faith-based organizations, in your nonprofits, and so on. And they're the kinds of things that make life go smoother if you know what they are. But if you don't know what they are, you can really put your foot in it. And so the thing to do personally is understand when you go into a new setting that there are rules there and you might not know them. So you need to pay attention to what other people do so that you don't get off on the wrong foot. Oh, now my slide's not advancing. I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to go out and start again and see if it works. So, no. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try again. It's not advancing from my end. So I will try it again. Hopefully now you all are seeing the slides sort of streaming past you real quickly.
Actually, Catherine, all we're seeing is you.
You're not, okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. All right. Get back to. All right. I didn't do it the right way. How about now? Do you see it now?
We see it now.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Thanks for letting me know, Vicki. Okay, so we are going to talk now about some examples of hidden rules in poverty and middle class and wealth. And the first one is, how do these various groups look at food? Should be a relatively simple question. In poverty, the important rule about food is, did you have enough? The most important thing about food in poverty is, was there enough for everybody? And if you have ever been to a dinner or a reception in a group that is basically running on poverty rules, you will see mass quantities of food in great big aluminum pans. And it is very important that there be enough food. In the middle class, we don't worry so much about, do we have enough? We know we have enough. You know, we bought on purpose to make sure we would have not just enough, but a little extra in case somebody wanted seconds or thirds, or they wanted to take a plate home to another family member. So the key question is, did you like it? The quality of the food is very important. If we clean up our kitchen after a dinner party and we realize that we have a whole lot of the Brussels sprout casserole left, we know that no one liked it and we never fix it again. In wealth, the key question is, because they know there's enough, you know, they had plenty of money to buy enough, they know that it tasted good because probably their chef cooked it. So their main concern is, was the food presented well? Was it arranged nicely on the plate? Did it look attractive? Was it very artful? So Poverty, is there enough? Middle class, did you like it? Wealth, the presentation is important. In possessions, we talked a little bit about, when we talked about mental model, our possessions in poverty are our people, the people in our life, our kids, our parents, our siblings, our next door neighbors, the people that we have relationship with are our most important possessions. And this is kind of a default thing because people in poverty don't own a whole lot else. There are no family heirlooms, there's no house, there's no big fancy car. So what's important to us are the things that we do have, which is our people and our relationships. In middle class, our possessions are our things. Shopping as an activity or as a fun thing to do is kind of a recent thing. People used to shop because they needed something. Now we shop for entertainment or amusement. So the things that we have, and remember the guy in the video who had the great big TV, that was a thing and it was important to him. It was a status symbol. And he was very proud of that. That was a possession that was important to him. In wealth, it's stuff, but it's one-of-a-kind things. It's artwork, it's legacies, it's pedigrees, it's furniture with a provenance that came from our second great-grandmother who brought it from the family estate in Whereverville. It's important stuff. It's one-of-a-kind stuff that no one else can have. So poverty possessions are people, middle class possessions are things, and in wealth, it's your one-of-a-kind objects and your legacy and your pedigree stuff. In time, the hidden rule for poverty, and we know this because we talked about it in mental models, the present is most important. Our decisions are made for the moment based on feelings of survival. That is directly caused by the tyranny of the moment. That is directly caused by the fact that it is so difficult for people in poverty to get through today, to deal with all of the things coming at them today, that they just flat don't have the time or the wherewithal to think about something that's going to happen 2 days from now or next week or beyond. The present is what's important and can very often be the source of bad decisions, bad money spending, and things like that. In the middle class, and we talked about this when we talked about mental model, the future is most important. People in the middle class live a couple of years in the future, and this is evidenced by our planning for retirement, our VRS account or our 401k. We plan our vacation time. When we go to work, we check our vacation time to make sure we're going to have enough time, to go to the beach in 4 months. When we make a decision, whether it's to buy a car or sell our house or sometimes just to buy a new pair of shoes, we stop and think, can I afford this? If I spend this money on this particular thing, am I still going to be able to meet my car note or my mortgage payment? In wealth, and again, we talked about this, tradition and history are more important because wealthy people are okay for today. Their kids are okay for today and tomorrow and into the future. Probably their grandkids are taken care of into the future. So, and for wealthy people, their traditions and history are more important. And decisions are made based on tradition or decorum. Everybody in my family went to whatever school. And if you remember in the video, The Nation of Tribes, the gentleman who was living in his family home, which was somewhat run down, he looked like he was teetering on the brink there, but he had that wealthy mindset that tradition and history are more important. Now, he might not be able to afford to put a roof on that house, but the fact that he lives in his grandfather's or his great-grandfather's house is very important to him. And the lady who lived in her husband's family home, when she talked about redecorating the dining room, she talked about her own individual taste, but she still had the portrait of the great-grandfather hanging on the wall. So time for wealthy people is often measured in tradition and history. Destiny is a big dividing line. People in poverty believe that their destiny is controlled by fate, and they just can't do anything to change that, to mitigate the chance. Partially, this is caused by living in the present. Fate is something that happens in the future. It's not something that's happening today. And partly it's caused by the fact that people in poverty really don't have a lot of choice. They don't necessarily live where they want to live. They live where they can afford to live. Or they live where someone has taken them in. They may not be eating what they want to eat. They're eating what they can afford to eat. And because there's so little choice in their life, they begin to have the understanding that they can't do anything to change their lot in life. And if you believe that you can't do anything to change it, that really does handicap you as far as even beginning to try. In the middle class, we believe in choice. We believe we have choice because we have choice. We may not live in the most expensive house we would want to live in, but we live in a house that we are comfortable with and that we can afford. We have a wider range of options. We also understand that we can change our future if we make good choices now. We understand that if we eat healthy food and we get exercise, we can change our future because we will be healthier. We will not be sick as often. We will be mobile longer. And so we understand that if we make good choice now, we can change our future because we know how to future plan and we have choice. The concept of destiny for the wealthy people is, it's a French term, noblesse oblige, and basically that means that wealthy people believe that they have been blessed by their set of circumstances, and so for those reasons they are obligated to provide for people with less, to donate the library, the hospital wing, the theater, whatever. But remember, they're going to put their name on it because their concept of time is the tradition going into the future. So they have to have the name on the building or the wing so that people know it was their particular family who believed in noblesse oblige. The worldview for poverty, people see the world in terms of local setting because that's where they're stuck. It's very difficult to care about what's going on across the Commonwealth of Virginia when you're living in Accomack County. You've always lived in Accomack County, and you don't see any possibility of getting anywhere outside of Accomack County. The middle class is more likely to see the world in terms of the national setting because they've been out of their state. They've been out of their locality. They've been out of their state. And so they pay more attention to what's going on the national setting than people in poverty. Whereas the wealthy, because they very likely have a home or a business opportunity in another country, they see the world in terms of an international view. And the way that you see the world is very often going to have an impact on the choices that you make, the things that you get involved in. Some people don't see much of the world beyond the block that they live on. They might be involved in local politics, but certainly nothing beyond that. For people in poverty, power is linked to personal respect and the ability to fight, and that you can't stop bad things from happening. We didn't talk very much about the importance of the ability to fight in poverty, but when your housing situation is unstable and you may find yourself living from time to time in a homeless shelter, or you may find yourself crashing on somebody's sofa, you may be bringing your kids and your family into someone else's home, and so the need to be able to take care of yourself gets to be pretty important, because you are entering in a volatile, possibly, or unfamiliar situation. So you feel the need to take care of yourself. My daughter is a middle school teacher, and she's a pretty good teacher, and she's very lively. And she had a student some years back who kept falling asleep in her classroom, and that was something that had never happened to her before, to have a student just sleep in her classroom. So she went to the guidance counselor, and she told the guidance counselor, I wish you'd talk to this little girl. She keeps falling asleep. Well, what the guidance counselor found out was that the child and her family had just moved into the apartment of a friend of her mother's, and the child was sleeping in a bedroom with older children that she did not know and she did not feel comfortable with. And she knew she could not defend herself if something happened. So she tried very hard to keep herself awake all night. And when she got to school and she felt safe, then she allowed herself to fall asleep. We have a gentleman from the Richmond area in the General Assembly who, and I don't talk a lot of politics, but this was such a good example. He's a very controversial person. He's been disbarred from practicing law twice now, and his logo is boxing gloves, and his logo is "Joe will fight for you." So a couple years ago, he ran for mayor in the city, and he was the leader throughout the lead up to the election, and he was always the front runner. And I was so puzzled by that, because, as I said, he was fairly controversial and had been disbarred and had all kinds of things in his personal life. Well, at that point in time, the rate of federal poverty in the city of Richmond was almost 26%. So who he was the front runner among was people in poverty who saw his ability to fight, or his willingness to fight, as a real positive. So how that turned out is he actually came in a distant third. It could be that the people who were going to support him never got to the polls, or they thought that he was going to have enough to win. Anyway, he didn't win that election, but he did win another one later, and he's now in the state Senate. So for a person in poverty, power is definitely related to the ability to fight and defend yourself. In the middle class, power and respect are separated. As an example, I might understand that a member of city council has some power in my locality, but I don't necessarily respect that person. I would probably respond to the position, but power and respect are definitely not married. They're not linked. The middle class definitely sees power in information and institutions, and this, I think, links directly back to achievement as being an underlying principle in the middle class. If a person in the middle class gets a speeding ticket and they don't like the way the officer spoke to them, they're going to get the badge number and they're going to call the police chief. They understand where the power is in that particular situation. How people in wealth look at power is, and we talked about this in Mental Model, is they see the power in expertise and connections. And I think I told you about Maggie Walker's house in Richmond, where in her library she has pictures of very important and influential people of her moment in time. As you know, she was the daughter of a slave, and after the Civil War, her mother took in laundry to take care of her family. And Maggie would deliver the laundry to her mother's customers, and then she later grew up to be the founder and owner of a bank here in Richmond. And so I thought it was very interesting that she had pictures of important people that she knew in her office, in her home, because she understood that there was power in connections, and she wanted people to understand that she was connected to powerful and influential people. People in wealth see that there is power in stability, in having been in the same position, in the same place over time. And because of their connections, people in wealth are able to influence policy and direction. And so if they get a speeding ticket and they're not happy about it, they're more than likely to call the governor than to rail at the particular officer who wrote the ticket. So we talked about the underlying principles in the three classes. The driving force in poverty, as we talked about a Mental Model, is survival. Just getting through today. Can I get to work? Do I have enough food? Is there gas in the car? Do I have a babysitter for tomorrow? Am I going to be able to pay my rent even though I lost a day of work this week? Our driving force is for poverty is also a relationship, and sometimes the fear of losing a relationship will keep a person tied into poverty. People in the middle class are absolutely thrilled when their kids go away to college, and they renovate the kid's bedroom into a sewing room or an office or weight room. People in poverty, that's terrifying to think that a child will go away, because the relationships, the people in their life are what they own. So they are very fearful of their children moving onward and upward, because then they're very fearful that they will lose the child. Entertainment is a driving force in poverty. If you remember in our circular discourse, What About Jack? The story that the child told about Jack was way more entertaining than just the middle class beginning, middle, and end story that you would have heard about a similar situation, but if it was middle class people. So in middle class, the driving forces are work. If you go to a party in the middle class, the first thing anybody asks you after they ask you what they can get you to drink is, what do you do? Achievement is very important in middle class people, and I was guilty of this myself. We put our degrees and diplomas and certificates and awards on the wall so that people will know we've achieved something, and we're worth listening to. Material security is also a driving force in the middle class because we are hooked into, a couple years into the future, and we want to make sure that we can maintain and survive and maybe improve our status quo into the future. So our material security is important in the middle class. In the wealth class, our financial, our political, and our social connections are what's important. Wealthy people are hit on or contacted constantly for donations or support, or they don't just buy a ticket to an event, they buy a table and then they sponsor the event. So they are very leery of the connections that they make with people because they don't want to be hit on all the time. And if you meet people in the middle class at an event or a party, they pretty much want to know, how did you get in the room? Who was your connection? And why are you okay and to be in the room? So the driving forces are very much based on, for the three classes, are based on where you are in society. So take just a minute and talk and review in your own mind what hidden rules are, and if anybody has an example of a time when they ran into a hidden rule and they really did not understand what was happening, then put that in the comments section. And I'll give you just a minute to process hidden rule and maybe share one or two with the group. Okay, I hope you were able to come up with an example of hidden rules. If you have any questions of hidden rules, please be sure to share those in the question and answer comment. And when we have new people come into our group or our organization where we work, you can't assume that people always know what the rules are. So if there are specific rules that someone would need to know, particularly if someone comes out of a slightly different, I hate to use the word class, but that's the word we've got. If they come from a different class than what you've come from, take the time. You cannot, you just can't assume that people know. And if they have come from a different socioeconomic status than you, then they need to have things explained to them. And when you go into a setting, it probably is not possible to understand or immediately infer what the hidden rules are. But remind yourself that there are probably some rules here. For example, you may have noticed this in your own organization when you have a staff meeting. People generally gravitate to the same place every single time. And I know in the various agencies I've worked in, particularly when I was the director, I never had to say, yeah, so the head of the table seat is mine. Everyone just sort of knew that that was my chair because, I was the director. I never had to say that. But people are creatures of habit, and they do the same thing all the time. And, if you are a churchgoer or you belong to an organization or a civic group or something, people will do the same thing. I mean, if I go into church and I'm a little bit late and somebody's in the pew that I always sit in, I'm always just a little annoyed that someone had the nerve to sit in my seat. So it's important to remember when you have a new person, and particularly, as I said, a person who comes from a different background than you do, to help them understand that there are rules and that we teach the rules. And that when we deal with other people from poverty, from the middle class, from wealth, there are 3 sets of rules. And help people understand the hidden rules of the work and agency setting, and that the people that you're dealing with, your customers and your employees, are bringing their rules with them. And if they are a person who has grown up in poverty, their idea of conflict resolution may be based on the concept that it's very important to be able to fight and defend yourself in poverty. But fighting and defending yourself is not an acceptable form of conflict resolution in a work setting. The same as, catcalls on a street corner, while not the classiest thing you can do, are more likely to be tolerated outside on a street corner than they are in the Xerox room in your building. So I think now we're gonna look very quickly at the video on Mama Rule. Yes.
Can you hear me? Before you start, I have 2 comments in reference to your conversation.
Okay.
The first person shared that African Americans tend to sit together even if they have never met. I guess that's their unhidden rule.
Yeah.
And the second person said that she and a friend were out shopping in Williamsburg and walked into the lobby at King's Mill and were pretty quickly approached by a staff member asking if they needed anything. She said, "We didn't ask for help. It was pretty clear we appeared that we didn't belong there."
Yeah. And that's painful. I don't care who you are. That is painful to listen to. I worked at an agency where I realized, after I'd been there a couple days, I realized that 12 to 1 was white people lunch and 1 to 2 was black people lunch. And it was consistent. And finally, I approached one of the people I had noticed in the first group and asked her, "What is that about?" And did the same thing with a person that I felt that I had a good relationship with in the second group, and said, "What is that about?" Well, it turns out that the 1 to 2 o'clock people, it was more about a particular soap opera than it was about anything else. That's the story I got. And it was just a pattern. And the group, the whole staff as a whole, seemed to get along fairly well. But it was very obvious after a couple days. I realized that I saw the same thing from time to time to time. And it was just an example of a hidden rule. So if we can, Erin, if you can launch the Mama Rules now, that would be great.
I can remember an occasion when 2 of my students were fighting at school. I mean, they were going at it on the playground. And at the elementary level, children who are fighting have a tendency to get really angry at each other. And if they're little boys, they puff up because that means you're really tough. And so they were all puffed up, you know. And when I got them to the office, I asked them a terrible question. I said, what happened? Well, they really huffed up then. And that's really probably the worst question you could ask. Because when you ask what happened, you're never going to get an accurate story. And so I said, okay, you go first. Well, the story gets very loud. I don't know why, but when kids are explaining, the story's loud. You may have noticed that. So I said, okay, Jack, what happened? He said, well, see, we was playing. Everybody was playing. It's important to include everyone so you're not in trouble by yourself. And he said, we was kicking. Everybody was kicking. And then he kicked my cousin. And my mama said, I said, stop right there. Because I knew we were getting into a hidden rule. The mama rule. You see, there's mama law and there's public law. No law overrides mama law. Did you know that? If you didn't know, that's a hidden rule you must remember. When your mama says it, it becomes engraved in stone. So I knew what he was going to tell me. I said, your mama said if somebody hits you, hit him back, right? And he said, right. And my mama said if somebody messed with anybody in my family. I said, okay, I know the rules. Stop right there. So I asked him, I said, where's your mama work? And he forgot he was supposed to be huffed up. And he said, at the telephone company. And I asked the other little boy where his mom worked. And he said, at Prudential. He was still puffed up. And I said, okay, your mom works at the telephone company. Your mom works at Prudential. Did your mom say you could fight telephone company? Yes, ma'am. She said, bust them up. And I said, did your mom say you could fight? Yes, ma'am. She told me to defend myself. I said, all right, we got the rules straight. And they said, are we suspended? I said, absolutely, because that's my rule. If you fight at school, you get to go home for 2 days. Well, they were pretty upset with me by this time. I said, but we have to do some things first. He said, what do we have to do? I said, well, first, we're going to go to the telephone company. And their eyes got real big. Because one of the hidden rules about working is that you don't bother your parents on their jobs. And he said, are you going to call our mamas? I said, no, I'm going to take you over there. And they said, oh, no, by this time the huff and puff was gone out of both of them. I said, this is how it's going to work. First, we're going to the telephone company, and we're going to fight at the telephone company. I want you to tear up the telephone company. Roll on the floor, kung fu kick, just like you were doing here. But don't hurt each other too badly because we're going to leave the telephone company and we're going over to Prudential. We're going to fight at Prudential. You can really fight over there. That's the last stop. You can make blood, pull hair, snatch each other's clothes off. I can run you by the hospital, get anything broken, set in a cab, push your eyeball back in your head. Then you can begin serving your 2-day suspension. They said, Miss Pearson, you know we can't fight on our mama job. I said, why not? Your mama made the rule. Let's go where your mama is. They said, oh, we're dead. We're not going to make it. And they just fought. I said, go sit on the blue seats outside my office while I call your parents. Tell them we're on our way. Get some boxing strategy in place so you'll know how you're going to fight once we get there. Oh, they were so sad. They just drug out of there. Well, first of all, you know I wasn't going to take those kids to their parents. But it was the first time I used a strategy that I've never used before, but I've used a lot since, and it has never failed me. When I called each parent, what I said was, I respect the rules you make for your children at home. You see, there's been a misconception that people who have children don't always make the right decisions about their kids. You see, parents make decisions for their children based on what they know, what they feel will make them safe. And it is not our place to say what they do is wrong. It's our place to say maybe we can add a set of rules that they don't know about. So I began both conversations by saying how much I respected their decisions that they were making for their children, and would they help me. I said, I know you made rules for home, and I promise not to interfere with those, but I need some help. I have 1,200 children in this building, and I have to keep all of them safe. And if everybody fought because their mom said they could, all the children here would be in trouble or hurt. Will you help me? I have never had a parent to tell me no. And I believe it's because I preface it by saying, I respect the rules you've made. And what I give the kids, in addition to their parents, is an opportunity to develop a second set of rules. Many times, to explain this point even further, I've asked parents, would you go on your job and punch a coworker because they disagreed with you? And of course, most of them said, no way. And I asked why, and they said, we'd lose our jobs. And I said, and I want kids to understand that the same concepts apply on their job, which is school. So we need to learn different ways of handling conflict, because fighting is not always an option. Two sets of rules, one set of rules for home, another set of rules for school.
Okay, I love Rita's videos. If you want to see more of Rita, you can go to YouTube, Rita Pierson. I think she's Pierson, and she does another one called School Starts at 8, which also talks about rules. So today we've talked about causes of poverty, and we've talked about hidden rules. And are there, Vicki, are there any questions or comments that came up?
Nope, I don't have any comments at this time.
Okay. Does anybody want to send in a comment real quickly? Or Vicki, do you have any comments about hidden rules? Or are there any other questions about the hidden rules, and how important it is to help people understand that no matter where you go, there's a set of rules in that place, and you're not going to know them, but you need to be aware that they exist, and be cautious when you go in to help people so that you learn and don't make a mess of things. You understand that there are rules there. And I see I just got a comment about Rita. I love her. She is a great and entertaining speaker, and she really is. She's funny, but she's also very profound. And so in our classes of poverty and middle class and wealth, it is very helpful to understand what the hidden rules are and what those classes place value on, particularly what people in poverty place value on as far as destiny and time and those kinds of things. So unless, wait, one more new question. Let's see. Someone asked, why do African Americans always sit together? And I would guess for the same reason white people sit together. We sit where we're comfortable. We sit where we think we're going to be welcomed. It's the human condition. We do what's familiar. So, but it is, when you notice it, it can be upsetting and makes you wonder, is there something going on here beyond just, people who are friends and people who are comfortable with one another. Somebody made a comment that there are a lot of rules on the Eastern Shore between locals and come-heres, and I think that's an age-old fight in almost any locality in Virginia, the from-heres and the come-heres, and you can live someplace for 30 years, but you're still a come-here. And there's a difference in values. People who have lived in a place all their life don't necessarily want to see change. and people who have moved to the gorgeous Eastern Shore because they've retired, they want all the same amenities as maybe there were in the big city that they just left. But there's not as many people, or the tax base isn't such that they're going to have the same amenities. But there are hidden rules no matter where you go, and it's important for you to be aware of them and to help the people that we are in business to help navigate and understand that those rules are there, and to be cautious in entering a new place. And also, particularly when we're dealing with people in poverty, to understand the impact that their set of rules has on the choices that they make and the values that they have. So I don't see any more questions, and Vicki, nothing further from you?
I'll just make one comment just to share with, like, for myself. I'm a military dependent, or I was growing up, and I know the first time I went to a civilian school, someone informed me that their hidden rule was you don't make friends with military kids because they're going to move away.
Wow.
And it's hard not to take that personal if you don't know what the hidden rule is.
Right. And it really isn't anything about who you are as a person. What your talents are, what your personality is. It's based on truly something that as a child you had absolutely no control over. Sometimes the only way you know that there's a hidden rule and you broke it is when all of a sudden life gets awkward and everybody's quiet. Somebody's done something and you just might not know what it is. The important takeaway from hidden rules is understanding that they exist, understanding that they color how people react and respond in a given situation, and understanding that we need to help the people that we're in business to help to understand the existence of those rules. So I know we're a little bit early, but I told Vicki the other day that in my experience, you never got a bad evaluation in training for letting people go early. So thank you all for being here again, and I look forward to talking with you again tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
So thank you everybody for attending. Don't forget, tomorrow we will, just as a reminder, we will be doing a work group to carry on the work on poverty. That will probably happen in August, and I will give you an exact date tomorrow at the end of tomorrow's session. So think about if you would like to participate in that. And we look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you all.